in the end, the people who will listen to you, be they ministers or policymakers back in your capital if you're a diplomat, or opinion formers and thought leaders reading the media, they will pay real attention to the ones that make less noise, but which have actually a more solid basis and a personal credibility. So I think that's the key lesson.
Hello and welcome to Comms Life from APCO Worldwide. I'm your host, Tom Billinghurst. Every episode we take a deep dive into the topics and trends shaping the communications landscape and beyond. In this episode, we're looking at the challenges that leaders face when communicating politically sensitive changes to the status quo in the context of the recent normalization agreement struck by the UAE, Bahrain and Israel. With the ever-evolving and fragmented geopolitical landscape of the Middle East, progressive policies and peace deals have often been met with roadblocks and speed bumps. The historic Abraham Accord, the normalization of relations between the UAE and Bahrain with Israel, could, however, signify a change in the road ahead. But can it? What challenges remain? Joining us to discuss these questions and more is James Watt, former British ambassador to Egypt, Jordan and Lebanon, and who worked with three different prime ministers, Tony Blair, Gordon Brown and David Cameron. Today, James is part of the Ambassador Partnership, an international consultancy of former ambassadors. James, welcome to the show.
Hi, Tom. Good to be with you.
Thanks so much for joining us from what I'm assuming is somewhat of a wintry Westminster. James, as we touched on there, you've done a lot and seen a lot in a storied career, but could you maybe pinpoint for us one of the most exciting or enthralling or challenging moments in your career?
I think the single most exciting moment was probably when I found myself in Kabul in Afghanistan in September 1996, all on my own, no comms, when suddenly the city fell to the Taliban. That was quite exciting. But that was on the kind of professional, adventurous side of things. But the professional side of things, I think must have been my experience in Cairo during the Arab Spring.
It was in 2011 at the time that you were serving as the British ambassador to Egypt, correct?
Yes, in fact, when the Arab Spring broke out earlier that year, I was ambassador in Jordan, and I didn't arrive in Cairo until June 2011, by which time things were a little bit clearer. So I missed the first flush of the excitement, if you like. After that, we had the whole period of the elections, the Muslim Brotherhood taking power in Parliament, and President Morsi being elected and then being overthrown, and President Sisi coming in. So it was quite a varied and exciting 3 years, with just so much that was totally new in it, in the sense that you felt that history really had taken a jerk forward, if you like. The continuity of the Arab world's history had been broken. And there was a lot of thinking to be done, a lot of interpretation, and a lot of unknowns, as you can imagine, a lot of uncertainty. Living day by day, trying to interpret very confusing events. And trying to interpret that back to an audience in London who were highly intelligent, but not specialists, perhaps in Egypt or in the very latest in Middle East trends. So trying to simplify the message, trying to make sense of it was a challenge, which I greatly enjoyed.
Exciting and enthralling are certainly one way of looking at it. Now, it's an interesting and a great segue actually into the next question, because when the Arab Spring erupted in 2011, much of it was fueled and propagated by social media, which was emerging at the time. So I wonder, from an ambassador's perspective, what you think the rise of social media and citizen journalism has done for transparency and stability in the region.
Well, certainly social media enabled people to communicate, ordinary people. You could call them activists or simply politically aware people who wanted something better for their country. They could communicate and they could mobilize. But if you think also that social media later on became much more a tool for repression and for the suppression of facts and of opinions and of political dissent, if you like, the picture is very mixed. So the Arab Spring, yes, it was carried forward on a wave of citizen journalism and freedom of expression. And then, as you know, it all came to nothing. In fact, it ended in tragedy in many places, with the exception of Tunisia. And freedom of speech is cruelly repressed now in most parts of the Arab world.
I wonder on a similar topic, James, how social media has affected the intel and the sources of information, or the role of the fourth estate in diplomatic circles. Has it changed, or did it change the way that you operated and fed back to heads of state at all?
It's a very interesting question, because already diplomats were under pressure to become more like journalists, in the sense of having blogs and tweets and to be generally getting out there, getting their government's viewpoint across to the wider population. And that actually has its dangers and hazards. It's all right in a benign environment. When you get to a fairly critical environment, like the uprising in Egypt, it was more important than ever, in my view, and that's the line I took when I was there, to be a trusted channel of communication. And to do that, you had to try to make clear that your country's policies were well-founded and sensible, but also at the personal level, you had to be personally credible and personally accepted by your interlocutors.
An increasing issue in today's geopolitical world, the spread of fake news. I find that a particularly interesting facet of your job, where you say you were almost taking on a role of a quasi-journalist as a diplomat, as the years went on, with the amount of information that was available. So I wonder, I mean, if we can bring that back to the communications industry, what lessons or skills you would say that communicators in this day and age, especially those that work with government entity in public affairs, and that are part of this diplomacy circle? I guess you could say diplomacy is a soft skill in itself, but what lessons or skill sets would you say are relevant across the two fields, diplomacy and communications?
I think it all comes down to credibility and trust. As an individual journalist, one of the great foreign correspondents, or one of the great columnists, or whatever, you will get a following, and you will get people reading you, taking account of your views seriously, if they trust you personally, if you've got a track record of factuality, objectivity, fairness, insight as well, forward thinking, and you avoid all the other traps, which, being ideological, being too ready to pursue a partisan line, or too careless with the facts, or not sufficiently good at fact checking, let's say. So when diplomats and serious journalists have that in common, we've got to be credible, and that sometimes means you're in a noisy battle and your voice is rather a quiet one. But in the end, the people who will listen to you, be they ministers or policymakers back in your capital if you're a diplomat, or opinion formers and thought leaders reading the media, they will pay real attention to the ones that make less noise, but which have actually a more solid basis and a personal credibility. So I think that's the key lesson.
Thanks for tuning into Comms Life by APCO Worldwide. If you're enjoying this, subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us wherever you get your podcasts from. Catch up on all our previous episodes, where we discuss everything from the future of aviation with Arabian Aerospace to the global economic recovery with The Economist.
We're still here with James Watt, former British ambassador to Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. Now, for season 2 of Comms Life, we're taking a look at a recent and relevant news article to get our guests' take on it. The one we're looking at today is the news of the normalization of relationships between the UAE, Bahrain, and Israel. An article that we're looking at is from The National, titled "A New Era Towards Security and Prosperity. UAE Foreign Ministers Meet in Historic First." The article is on The National's website, and it begins thus. The UAE hopes its burgeoning relationship with Israel will, quote, strengthen international stability, Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed, Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, said. Sheikh Abdullah was speaking alongside Israel's foreign minister after a meeting on Tuesday, as the two countries begin to forge relations following the signing of the Abraham Accords. Now, James, this article is part of a wider piece of a truly historic moment. There was a quote that caught my eye, or a couple of quotes in here that caught my eye that I'd like to run past you. There's a part that says both ministers, both foreign ministers, the UAE's foreign minister and the Israeli foreign minister, said the accord heralded a new era of stability in the Middle East. Sheikh Abdullah said that tolerance and pluralism must be strengthened in the region. Now, coming to you, James, we know this is diplomatic talk. We see a lot of this. But what does this mean in practical terms? Can we really expect the heralding of a new era of stability with these talks?
Of course, any improvement in relations, any building of trust is extremely welcome in the region, where, as you know, there are many fault lines, there are many sources of instability. There are some actual active conflicts, and there are many huge challenges still facing the region. One of them, of course, is economic. There's a great problem of youth unemployment. There's a great problem of overpopulation, if you like, in that sense. There's a problem of climate change leading to water loss and stress of various kinds. So the region really is facing some major challenges of its own, in addition to its conflicts and tensions. So any step like this is welcome. But I think the UAE has got a number of motives in this, which are alongside, if you like, any concern for the Palestinians. One is to find more allies and stronger allies in its struggle for regional prominence, if you like. And in that sense, it was very useful for the UAE to have a good accord with good understanding with Israel, and also to gain more favor in Washington. Washington was already, of course, very much in favor of the UAE, but I think is bound even more tightly in that American opinion, that part of American opinion which strongly supports Israel, will now be even better disposed now towards the UAE.
The fact that the Abraham Accord talks were held, and a word we've often seen is brokered, owing to a certain business mentality that is in Washington at the moment, brokered by the US administration. Tell us, as an ambassador, what does that symbolize? And what does that tell us about the influence and the role of the US in the region? What are they getting from this?
The US has always sought to have a strong regional preeminence, if you like, a strong set of alliances, and also protecting Israel from the threat that is occasionally uttered by Iran. There is a real threat of conflict between Iran and Israel. But back in Israel and Palestine, you do have this unresolved question, unresolved problem. And I think anybody who's serious about stability in the region has got to address this. And I hope as the next chapter after these Abraham Accords, we will now get a resumption of serious Arab efforts to engage Israel, reassure Israel that the best thing for Israel is to settle this and to remove not the only underlying cause, but probably the major underlying cause of instability and ideological conflict in the region.
We hope you're enjoying this APCO Worldwide production. To find out more of what we do in the communication space, head to apcoworldwide.com and see how we are helping firms build back stronger.
We are still here at Comms Life from APCO Worldwide with James Watt, former British ambassador to Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. In our final segment, one we couldn't do away with due to a fan favorite from season one, is the Getting to Know You segment, James. So I've got a list of a few questions here that will just help us delve a little bit closer to the human and not necessarily the professional, if you're happy for me to fire some of these at you.
Right, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, here we go. So, your earliest childhood memory?
I think my earliest sort of clearest childhood memory is on my grandparents' farm in Devon. They had dairy cows and they had chickens and they had all sorts of livestock. And running around as a tiny boy in my Wellingtons, getting into various scrapes, was probably the happiest, earliest childhood memories I have.
Lovely bucolic memory that will chime accord with many a Briton in the countryside. One day or one moment from your life that you would relive again? Well,
I think happiness for me, and I think for almost everybody, it revolves around family. And I think an occasion where you get your entire family together and it's a very happy occasion in itself and everybody's happy and everything goes perfectly, that is probably the day I'd like to relive. And the one day which most meets those criteria is my son's wedding 7 years ago. A beautiful wedding in the English countryside again. Lovely sunny June afternoon, marquee flowers, lots of happy people, very good atmosphere. So that's the one I'd rerun.
Idyllic. Okay, one work of art that you would say everyone has to read, see, experience, listen to?
That would be the music of Mozart. I just think he's just extraordinary. He's got a certain divine quality, that touch of absolute beauty and assurance, combined with all sorts of things. A little bit of irony, a little bit of spirituality sometimes, but it isn't just. They're not just chords of music. There's a whole complex and extraordinary life there.
Man after my own heart. James Watt, thank you ever so much for your time. Thanks for joining us on Comms Life. Thanks for listening to Comms Life. If you like that, leave us a rating on Apple Podcasts. Send us any questions or comments on our Twitter page. And while you're at it, you can subscribe to and download Comms Life on our YouTube channel or wherever you get your podcasts from. Stay safe and be well.